Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Rob Farley. I'm an assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the Kentucky. And with me today is Dan Nexon, who is your associate right now, right?
I am an associate professor of government and in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University.
Georgetown University. We are recording this on Thursday when the NCAA tournament has just started. I believe Georgetown is still in, whereas Kentucky tragically lost in the first round of the NIT 2 days ago. So just to position us all in basketball terms.
Don't worry, I wouldn't ever bet against the proposition that Georgetown will choke in the tournament.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm holding out hope that the Ducks can escape the first round. We'll see. That's a little bit later this afternoon. And I suppose when people see this, we'll know the answer to that. Anyways, we are here not to discuss the disaster of Kentucky basketball, but rather to discuss the Iraq War. We're a couple days past the 10th anniversary of the Iraq War, but it's been sort of dominating conversation in foreign policy and international relations. Themed people.
Yeah, I know. I was just going to say, I feel like we're back in the early days of the blogverse, right? I mean, it's 2003, 2004 all over again.
Right. I mean, there's a nostalgia about the whole thing, and I should say, I mean, I wasn't even in the blogverse. Warriors Fans and Money didn't start until May of 2004, so I wasn't even part of the blogosphere when all this was happening, but I was certainly paying attention to the conversation. But anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the 10-year anniversary. We're going to talk about what it means for, especially the academic study of IR, and we're going to, I think, build from there into some conversations about sort of broader interpretations of the international order and of the concept of international order. So I guess starting off, maybe a place to start would be this. Dan Dresner wrote a piece a couple days ago talking about how, I mean, I guess he made two claims. One, that the Iraq War hasn't really fundamentally changed how we should study international relations, we as IR professionals, and two, the major theories of international relations don't really suggest that the Iraq War has had much enduring impact on international order. And so, let's start there and see what we think of those. What do we think of those two arguments? Do you know the post I'm talking about?
I actually haven't read it, but I can probably guess what it looks like. I mean, I would say he's right about the first, which is probably of less interest to our audience, right? I don't know what about anything the Iraq War should change about international relations theory. I don't think it changed anything empirically. I mean, we're still doing what we do. The best argument I think you could make is that it perhaps should provide greater impetus to those who look at psychological theories of decision-making.
Right.
In the sense that it seems like a lot of what happened within the Bush administration is better understood through the frame of both cognitive psychology and interpersonal psychology, in terms of how predispositions were affected by September 11th, and also the balance of power within the Bush administration was affected by September 11th, and probably less on these kinds of unitary states making rational decisions about whether or not to go to war, which is how we model a lot of the causes of war.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a limit there because you can reconstruct a rationalist account given those psychological priors. So, yeah.
Right. All right. I mean, some of the debate over the past 3 or 4 days, and this has been the popular debate, but it's also been taken up by academic specialists, is to what extent it is useful to describe the arguments that the Bush administration made in 2003 in terms by using the terms lying, or using the term lying, right? I mean, how much, lying, how much is dissembling, how much is sort of strategically withholding information. Peter Feaver has a very long post building on this other work, arguing that there were no lies, essentially, that everything was out there. And I think that your blog, The Duck, also had, I don't think you wrote it, but did you write it? The one about how, it's with a lie, there's not just the liar, there's also the audience that is prepared to hear what the liar has to say.
That was John Western,
yeah,
who wrote that.
Right. Which I thought was very interesting, and which actually, I don't know if you read, there was a recent piece by over at Crooked Timber by Corey Robin, who made a very, a similar argument, right, that whatever arguments that the Bush administration may have made in 2003, it wasn't just lying. It was a sort of a broader question of how the national security bureaucracy conceives of national security that made sort of these particular conceptions of security compelling within elite and popular circles. And that seems to me to be relevant to this conversation, not so much in, there's a psychological account there, but I think it's a different psychological account than the psychological account you're talking about, which seems to me sort of to be a psychological account of how an idea spread and gained currency within the bureaucracy. And this is sort of a broader set of arguments about how we psychologize at a national level the notion of national security, right, and how we understand that and how certain concepts take hold. And some of this is throwback to some very early work like Wolfers and so forth about how we think about national security and so forth.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't had a huge amount of patience for this discussion, I have to say. I mean, we can come back to the question of whether or not it's appropriate to characterize the Bush administration as lying, as exaggerating, or merely kind of engaged in a kind of cognitive bias whereby they dismissed dissonant information and affirmed information that fit their worldview. And then we have to distinguish between different actors within the Bush administration. Then we have to get into people's heads and things we probably wouldn't know even if we were friends with them, and we're not.
Right.
But I don't have a lot of patience for this because I think that you have to remember a couple of facts about the United States, certainly since World War II, which is that executives basically are able to do what they want in foreign policy, particularly when it comes to initiating conflicts. There really are no practical restraints on executive power. And those that are fairly minor, and they're hard to implement after the fact. So it's very hard, for example, to cut off funding for a conflict once it's been initiated.
Right.
And so you could go on about sort of deep structural pathologies in the United States. We could debate about whether or not those are just pathologies of being being a great power or being a dominant power, as the United States was in the 90s and continues to be today. But I think fundamentally, we overthink this, right? Executives can initiate force if they want to initiate force. When they do, there's invariably a rally around the flag effect. And then usually what happens, which is exactly what happened in the case of Iraq, is that after the initial rally around the flag effect happened, public opinion began to diverge along partisan lines, and you wound up with Republicans generally supporting the Iraq War because it was their president, and Democrats generally opposing it because they didn't trust that president, and independents splitting along the way that you would expect. Before and during the run-up to the Iraq War, I don't think there was ever sort of overwhelming support for the conflict, which further goes to the sort of sense that here's an area where the executive pretty much has just a wide degree of discretion.
Right.
And so I don't know. Is there anything? Yes, executives can invoke national security, and that's a potent argument, and they have privileged institutional positions that allow them to draw on intelligence or draw on privileged information, or claim that they have good intelligence or privileged information to say national security requires X. But, again, I just don't think that that's a sort of uniquely, there's anything sort of deeply wrong with the sort of American character that has anything to do with that.
Right. And so in that context, then we sort of come back to this argument that, we are still, to the extent the psychological factors matter, they primarily operate at an elite level because, fundamentally it's the policy elites within the White House who matter for these kinds of decisions. So, within this argument, then, would you be comfortable then in sort of coming through and saying, that as long as a sufficient mass within the Bush administration was committed to the Iraq War, that 9/11 was fundamentally not any kind of useful mobilization, except insofar as 9/11 may have affected the balance of power within the Bush administration with regards to the attractiveness of invading Iraq.
Well, you know, maybe someday somebody will write a definitive history, and it will be history not somehow plagued by after-the-fact CYA and all the other fun stuff that makes it very hard to figure out what goes on in some of these decisions. But I think my reading of this is probably along the lines of what you've just said. It was very, if you go back and you watch the presidential campaign of 2000, it's very clear that there are people involved in the Bush campaign who want to do something about Iraq, right? And so you have the spectacle of George W. Bush running on a humbler foreign policy and running on no nation building, at the same time that Dick Cheney in the vice presidential debates and in various settings is talking a lot about the failure of the Clinton administration to deal with the Saddam Hussein problem. People who also know people in the know also say that somebody like Paul Wolfowitz spent the 90s getting very obsessed with the idea of Hussein as this very evil person who had to be gotten rid of. So there were elements associated with the first Bush administration who had thought at the time that the U.S. should have gone to Baghdad, and who also felt that even if they weren't strongly in that camp, who looked back on the first Iraq War as a missed opportunity, and also as in some degrees, a defeat that was snatched from the jaws of victory. And so, yeah, there was a constituency within the Republican foreign policy establishment who had some allies in the sort of so-called liberal hawk group, but within the foreign policy establishment, within the Republican foreign policy establishment, who wanted to get Hussein. There were also people who, I think, wanted to get Hussein because of his supposed attempt to assassinate, and I don't know what the Iraq documents after the fact have said, to assassinate George H.W. Bush in Kuwait. And there were also people who were committed to a kind of the Project for the New American Century notion of U.S. hegemony, who saw this as an opportunity a good place for the United States to flex its muscles and demonstrate its dominance and get other countries to fall into line. And there were also people who had an agenda to demonstrate that a revolution in military affairs had happened. So there were all these constituencies that either wanted us to do something about Iraq, probably involving military force, and constituencies who also saw advantages to that line of activity if it opened up as an option. You probably also had elements within the U.S. foreign policy establishment who wanted to get Hussein for various reasons having to do with our history with him since the late 80s through the sanctions period. I do remember, I don't mean to kind of go on and on here, but I attended a talk by a former U.S. official, military official, right after September 11th. I mean, this was within weeks, in which he sort of stood up with a map of the world and he said that he basically said the U.S. is going to go into Iraq. And he said the reason the U.S. is going to go into Iraq is that we now have sort of motive and opportunity, and this is unfinished business in the views of a lot of important people who matter. So I think there was this constituency, and I do think that September 11th altered the balance of power within the Bush administration to allow them, the so-called neocon wing, to become ascendant. So yeah.
Okay, so I don't particularly disagree with all of. I mean, I guess I have. I wonder whether there are sort of. I mean, I guess interpreting all these questions in terms of are there checks on sort of the fallen foreign policy elite that are sort of exogenous checks within American politics, and I guess so if you were to say, here's the reason we didn't go to war against Iran in, say, 2007, when some of these same elements were kind of, had the same notion, the answer would be that there was no intra-elite consensus within the Bush administration for that sort of at the time, rather than it would have been impossible to mobilize public support around a war with Iran in 2007, which may or may not have been true. But I guess sort of more broadly, and getting back to my original question, your argument here would be that our extant theories of foreign policy and our extant theories of international behavior pretty much, maybe with some extra psychology added in, can handle explaining the decision to go to war in Iraq 10 years ago in relatively robust manner, right? That we have the tools, that have political science has given us the tools to understand what happened here.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's get on to the second point of Dan's or Dresner's suggestion, which I think leads into the rest of our conversation. What changes has the Iraq War wrought upon the international system, or are there ripples from Iraq that lead to sort of significant, meaningful differences if we had not waged a war in 2003? So has the international system changed? And I think it kind of implied that you think it has, or you disagree.
Well, I think you made a really important point in your short piece at The Diplomat, which is that the irony here is that one of the arguments for going into Iraq, one of the underlying policy wonk arguments, was to try to force a bandwagoning effect. Right? The idea was that if the U.S. invaded, it would sort of demonstrate the extent of U.S. military and political global dominance. And it would convince recalcitrant states to get on the bandwagon or else suffer the same fate as Saddam Hussein. And the two arguments for that being a possible outcome are, of course, Libya, and we can talk about why, if we really wanted to, we could hash out why that's a problematic case. And then the Iranian overtures that happened, right, that the Bush administration ignored. So you build the counterfactual case saying, had there been some minor differences in immediate policy, we would have realized more of those benefits. And then on the other side, of course, were the realists saying, no, it'll produce a balancing effect. Everybody will align against us because they'll see that the U.S. is predatory, right? And I don't think that's really been borne out either. But as you pointed out when you were talking about that first argument, the irony here is that it really, at the end of the day, made the U.S. look weak, right? That it actually... one of the old adages about power is that you never want to use it, right? Your power is best when you don't use it. Your military capabilities are best when you don't use them, when they're there as a kind of threatening, coercive, deterrent menace, and they don't have to be tested. In this case, I think that U.S. capacity not to blow things to smithereens, because that's undisputed, but to occupy and transform a country was pretty much shown as, a paper tiger. And in that way, I think the U.S. has lost some of the stature that it had in 2002 when it looked like the United States was a colossus astride the world. And I think Iraq showed that that was less the case than a lot of observers thought going into the Iraq War.
Right. I mean, so the standard story, and this gets us back to our shelling, is that you have to demonstrate not only capability but resolve to that capability. And the logic behind, or at least part of the logic behind Iraq, was that this demonstrates not only our capability but our resolve, and so therefore people take us seriously. And then presumably the lesson from Iraq is that, well, I'm not sure what the lesson is. I mean, and I think part of the point of my diplomat piece is that people are going to take different lessons about our capability and our resolve based on who they are. History doesn't just lay there. It speaks to us. It whispers to us. In large part because of what we want to hear from it, right? And so you can, if you want to, you can go ahead and you can read The Surge as this is really American stick-to-itiveness. This is American resolve. This is the American, in final analysis, capability of turning an unpleasant situation into a tolerable situation, and therefore this demonstrates fear us. I think I agree with you that not many people are reading it that way in the international system right now. That it doesn't seem that the Iraq War, understood as an 8-year endeavor, substantially increased perceptions of either American capability or resolve. Which is in itself a very curious thing, right? I mean, going and fighting a country for 8 years when the country is relatively small and it's a strategically relevant country, but that's the sort of thing that ought to demonstrate resolve, Right. I mean, the willingness to expend huge costs over relatively small issues is something that should demonstrate a lot of resolve. But again, I mean, at least it doesn't seem to me, in the glance out there, that the rest of the world has internalized sort of this understanding of resolve. But this is also, I mean, isn't this a very kind of realist way of thinking about international order? I mean, the other arguments about the effect of Iraq on international order are sort of did it substantially, did it wound the liberal international system? Did it wound sort of the normative undergirding of international society and so forth to have the hegemon going off and doing these kinds of things? I mean, do you take those arguments as seriously as sort of the basic realist case about resolve and power?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so I had this pet argument I used to make, which was, so one of the big arguments about the liberal order and the American-led liberal order, and the most prominent advocate of this, the most coherent articulator of this vision is John Eikenberry. Right? His argument was always, well, the United States had built an order which was uniquely stable because it provided so many benefits to so many people, but also because the United States was the first hegemon, dominant power in the world to really sort of tie itself to various kinds of multilateral and other kinds of institutional elements, architectures that restrained it. Right, so the states had to fear predation by the U.S., or were not as afraid of predation by the United States as they would have been, say, in a Nazi Germany hegemony after the Second World War, right, where the Nazis would have continued to be predatory towards everybody. The U.S. was able to signal that it wasn't through the United Nations, through NATO, etc. It's a story, right, and John certainly has amassed a lot of good arguments for it. But my sense was that whether or not he was right, it was a story that had been internalized in sort of the advanced industrialized democracies, right? That by and large, this was a story that, our allies told themselves, and that a lot of states on the periphery of that order also told themselves. So that the U.S. would be relatively benign because, look, it was part of this big order that was beneficial to us, et cetera. So my pet theory was that Iraq and the behavior of the Bush administration sort of undermined that illusion. Right? It gave the lie to the degree to which these kinds of constraints actually had any impact on U.S. decision-making. Right? It showed that you get an administration which is unilateralist and not particularly interested in an enormous amount of multilateral consultation unless it's to get its way, and they'll just run roughshod over everything. So that it sort of spoiled the game for everybody. I don't know if that's so true anymore. I mean, I think that I'm just not certain of the degree to which, I think maybe Dan's right. Maybe, a lot of the elements of liberal order don't look that different than they otherwise would have. I mean, and the flip side of that is once the Obama administration came in, sort of cooperation went up again. The Europeans proved pretty willing to commit to in ways that really they didn't want to for longer than you would expect to the International Stabilization Force in Afghanistan. I also think that from 2006 on, when the Bush administration, sort of when a lot of the more traditional non-neoconservative elements became in the ascendant in the Bush administration after 2006, you also saw, kind of a restoration. People were really angry. There was a lot of chilliness in the relationship. Certainly, the situation with Russia is a totally another story. But amongst our allies, I think there was already a kind of sigh of relief at that point. So I'm just not sure what really changed at the level of international order. I think you have to run a counterfactual and say, what would the international order have looked like had the United States not intervened? But I have to say that these things are very abstract. I think at the end of the day, when we think about the costs and benefits of this war, we really shouldn't lose sight of the 100,000 plus Iraqi surplus casualties, the amount of money the United States spent, and the amount of casualties and damage to the U.S. Domestic politics that resulted from it. So.
Right. This is an interesting story. If you look somewhere, if you look at contemporary balance in East Asia, it seems to be telling the story that the Iraq War really didn't mean that much, right? The East Asian states and the Southeast Asian states appear to be behaving in a fashion which is broadly in line with how Eikenberry thinks that they ought to behave within this particular hegemonic, right? That they see China to be a threat, and the way that they are managing that threat is not simply sort of in a realist fashion, bringing in the United States, because that's not the only realist option, right? They could be making their own, they could be engaged in bilateral relationships with one another, but they are sort of balancing China within the multilateral liberal internationalist framework that the United States has established, in which the United States is playing a major role, right? And so, I think if you look at South China Sea and you see what China's doing, and you see what Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam are doing, Japan and India, it's all fits very well within Eikenberry's story. But what about Latin America? And I know it's odd to sort of draw lessons from how the Iraq War may have affected politics in Latin America. And there's also, at the same time, there is sort of another demonstration effect, which is the attempted coup blamed on the Americans in Venezuela. But it seems that there is a broader willingness among the Latin American political elite to reject the story that Eikenberry wants to tell about how the United States should be seen. And there seems to be more willingness in the last 10 years to come back and say, no, this is, we should see the United States as in some way a predatory state. Even if this hasn't sort of necessarily resolved itself in terms of a large number of regimes, kind of acting like Venezuela or to a lesser extent Ecuador or Bolivia. But, even in states where you haven't had revolutionary change, you still have had sort of a greater need to deal with serious questions about the intentions of the United States. And again, that may just be about Venezuela and the coup and Chavez, but it might also be something about Iraq, right? It may be about Iraq sort of being that kind of vision of the international order. And before you answer that, I read an interesting piece, and I can't remember where it was linked to, about how Iraq has affected U.S.-Russian relations. And, again, and I'll try to find it. But it made the argument that, fundamentally the change hasn't been sort of in Russia's international behavior or in Russia's, or even in above board U.S.-Russian relations, but that it changed Russian domestic politics in a more authoritarian direction, which is an odd argument, but was quite interesting when posed. That essentially you had this contest, between what we're sort of in the early part of last decade, liberalizing elements and more authoritizing elements, and the increasing perception of the United States as a bad actor, or the ability of the authoritizing elements to portray the United States as a bad rogue actor, sort of gave them a leg up in Russian domestic politics. Again, I'm not sure I'm willing to fully stand by that argument, but it's an interesting case. But anyway, do either of those appeal to you in any fashion?
I don't know. Look, I sort of feel a little bit like I've inflicted something bad on our audience by kind of spinning my wheels, because I think we have to be really careful about how we think about all of these questions. And here's what I would say. There are a couple of things going on here. We're trying to sort of say, okay, well, what was the impact of the U.S. decision to invade Iraq after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan on the international order? And we're talking about sort of broad liberal principles. We're talking about the effectiveness of institutions. We're talking about U.S. relations with different regions, different specific countries. And we're also talking ultimately about whether or not the sort of liberal order as a whole lost some legitimacy in some places and with some specific elites or what have you, right? So there's that set of questions. But if we want to think about that, we have to sort of be thinking about a couple of other things, right? One is we have to be thinking about secular trends, right? So one of the big stories of the last 10 or 15 years has been, and we'll see whether it really plays itself out, has been the move towards global convergence, right? It's been the rise of China, the rise of Brazil, South Africa, So it's been economic growth in specific places in the global south, right, which has had big effects. So we've had this question of global convergence and what the effect that is going to have or is having on liberal order. We also have a set of things that we have to be thinking about as happening in the 90s, independent of kind of economic trends and how those might have played out. So one of the reasons I'm a little skeptical about Russia is they can always point to the Kosovo intervention. I think that gives you plenty of ammunition if you want to talk about the United States as being predatory towards the people who you say matter most to you, sort of the Slavs, Russian interests, etc. You also, I think, have coming out of, so you have sort of, the things that neoconservatives say that when they say that Iraq isn't out of line with past U.S. policy, they can point to Kosovo or whatever, right? So you've got a bunch of things that are happening there. But you've also got this big counterfactual question, because it's not, the real question, Iraq is sort of a particular manifestation of Bush foreign policy, right? And whether or not you and I are right, and there was a sort of decisive shift in Bush foreign policy that resulted from 9/11, certainly choices were made, things were wheels went into gear, wheels started to spin after September 11th that led the U.S. down a particular kind of trajectory in terms of how it articulated its grand strategy, how it pursued the war on terror, et cetera, right? So we can talk, and Iraq is just the sort of ultimate manifestation of that. There may be stuff that's making these arguments, and I just haven't seen them. But the way that most of the work I've seen on thinking back about the Iraq War has gone is it's been very focused on what was the impact of the Iraq War, and was the Iraq War worth it? And some of those questions have then spun out into, did it change the international order? Did it change the position of the United States? Would we have been better if we hadn't gone into Iraq? And that's fine. That could be your counterfactual. But I think it kind of misses the point, which is that Iraq was really was one element. It was the sort of, it was the linchpin element of the more general approach that the Bush administration took toward the war on terror. So Iraq is not really separable from the broader decisions that the Bush administration made in the wake of September 11th about how it was going to proceed in securing U.S. interests in a global struggle against violent extremism. And if you look back at the doctrine of preemption, and you look at the national security strategy as it was articulated in 2002, 2003, it's very clear that the whole thing's written as a justification for the Iraq War. Right? So that these aren't really separate things. The Iraq War is part and parcel. It is the crowning achievement, however you think of that as an achievement, of the Bush terror strategy. So the relevant counterfactual is not to think what would have happened if we'd run the same world but without intervening in Iraq. The relevant counterfactual is, what if a center-left Democrat had been in power? What would the Gore war on terror have looked like? And I think there's good reason to believe that the Gore war on terror would have, again, gone into Afghanistan. But we've seen Afghanistan not as the start of a series of U.S. interventions to show resolve and to crack down at potential, to sort of push everybody into the new American century, but as part of an effort to build thick global institutions, international rules to combat terrorism. So the emphasis would have been on multilateral policing. And the Afghanistan war would have been the most concerted war effort of that kind of policing. Right? That would have been the model.
Right.
That's potentially a very different world than the world we live in. Right? That's potentially a world where the window of opportunity created by September 11th is used to really upgrade liberal order capabilities. Right? Whether it's on counterterrorism, and we got a lot of that on counterterrorism, right? I mean, I think that, in fact, Bush administration deserves a lot of credit for building a lot of the infrastructure that we have now to combat terrorist financial transactions, to combat, kind of terrorist activity. So, I don't think it's right to think of them as not having completely forsworn that route. Right. But I think it's important to think about Gore as having done that times 2 or 3. You would have potentially had a much more robust regime to prevent weapons leakage, for example.
Right.
right? A big upgrading of these kinds of capabilities might have very well been the horizon. I think there's reasons to think that many of the most important players, the Russians, the Chinese, certainly the Europeans, would have gone along with this. In the wake of September 11th, there was a lot of political capital, and there was a lot on the part of the U.S. and a lot of countries in the world who saw this as an opportunity for getting on good terms in this order that was going to emerge when the U.S. took action.
Right. I mean, presumably states, not only states like Russia and China, which are in some sense, from a Bush administration point of view, also the sort of the secondary targets of the Iraq War in terms of development of launching resolve, deterrence, and so forth, but also Iran and perhaps North Korea sort of have a different vision of what the United States is trying to do, and this potentially leads to a different set of outcomes. I guess I have two questions. One, in this vision of the doubled down liberal internationalist order, responding in the way that it ought to in a liberal internationalist fashion by focusing on Afghanistan and focusing on it in a very multilateral way. I mean, what happens to this story of this sort of high-functioning LI order if the situation in Afghanistan looks like the situation in Afghanistan around 2007, right? I mean, what if we say that that there were just fundamental misunderstandings about Afghanistan? It wasn't just that the United States pivoted to Iraq, but also that it was just invading and restructuring the Afghan polity was just an extraordinarily onerous task and was likely to hit significant speed bumps. If that happens, what does this then? What are the implications that people take away from this liberal internationalist project? If sort of its centerpiece, which is the reconstruction of Afghanistan, runs into significant problems. And second, sort of does this particular logic of a muscular liberal internationalist order sort of lead us into places like Somalia in a way that we didn't really go in the wake of the Iraq invasion? Sort of as this order, this bringer of order to disordered spaces, in a sense, especially with the recognition that disordered spaces are dangerous. I mean, are these questions useful at all? In terms, are they getting to your point at all?
No, I think they're incredibly useful, but I think we need to distinguish between two types of muscular liberal international order. Mm-hmm. And I've actually written a book chapter on liberalism and empire that makes this point, mm-hmm. So I'm plugging that, but I actually think it was a fairly basic insight, but I like it, which is that neoconservatives remember are liberals, mm-hmm. right? And this is why liberal hawk, if you go back to the early 1990s, you really couldn't, I think we even talked about this in the last
right.
Blog and Heads that we did together, who is a liberal hawk, who is a neoconservative, not at all clear, right? It's primarily about partisanship, right. Not about fundamental worldview stuff, except for, that liberal hawks are a little bit more committed to liberal intergovernmentalism, and neoconservatives are a little bit less committed, per se. But that's precisely the point, is that if you understand that we're talking about variants of liberalism, you could think about sort of one view of muscular liberal international order, which is I call liberal intergovernmentalism, where the most important part of that order is institutional arrangements, treaties, and other kinds of governance regulations among states. And then there's muscular liberal international order, which is we will do whatever we can to spread the space that is governed by liberal regimes, right? And so now, the thing is that people who like liberal intergovernmentalism think that it's the best way ultimately to get to a more democratic global environment, not just at the level of democracy in a very attenuated sense among states, but democracy on the ground. People who believe in sort of expanding liberal space, muscular liberalism in that sense, the neoconservative vision, think that it gets in the way a lot because right. you have to bring authoritarian regimes into the deliberative process, and you have to give them a voice, and you have to give them veto power, right? there's truth on both of those counts, right? You know, the liberal intergovernmentalism can both be an advantage and a huge hindrance to spreading democracy throughout the world, right? But muscular liberal intergovernmentalism looks very different in that sense than muscular liberal interventionism, right? To complicate matters, though, you can use muscular liberal intergovernmentalism to engage in liberal interventionism, right? So it gets complicated, but if you hold that distinction in mind, I think this gets at the core of what I'm saying. I think that Afghanistan would have been, unless it goes beautifully in a way that I find very difficult to imagine, it's probably a one-off, right? And a lot more of the, instead what you get is muscular intergovernmentalism, right? You get much more focus on using international institutions to subvert, break, and impede global extremism or Islamic extremism. That still means you probably get a lot of U.S. sort of low-level interventionism of the type that we're seeing under Obama, but probably with some degree of more international sanction than you get now. That would be my sort of rough guess, but that's just a guess, right? So, yeah, I do think these are different, and I'm not sure that the Gore trajectory, as we're calling it, winds up getting you a lot of responsibility to protect interventions, right? It could or it could not. I don't know, but that's sort of independent from whether or not you at least tried to do your best to use this window to really upgrade global governance capabilities. And the reasons I think that might not be a good thing, but I think that's the different direction we might have gone in. And the decision point there is not the point of the Iraq intervention, it's the point of how do we think about what September 11th means. And that's the decision point we ought to be looking at, because that's the decision point that actually produced Iraq. I think that within a week of September 11th, the invasion of Iraq was inevitable. It may have been inevitable on the day of September 11th. Right. Given the predispositions of the Bush administration. I don't think that's the case, no matter how many people try to argue otherwise under a Gore administration.
Right. And actually, I mean, I think Fever at least dealt with that in one of his responses to this. So then, if we go back to a little bit of the earlier conversation, and I think this kind of builds a bridge to what else we were going to talk about, perhaps at least referencing this myth of the liberal international order. So the or the transformational moment for international order, whether liberal or alternative liberal, comes in the reaction to September 11th, and really, in some sense, comes in. If we accept that the Gore administration is going to act differently than the Bush administration is going to act differently now, comes in December of 2000, right, when the outcome of the election becomes clear, and that's sort of the systemic moment, the systemic change. If I'm understanding this argument in the right way.
I guess one way of saying this is that what we now know, and I don't think we necessarily knew this at the time, but what we now know because of the contingency of September 11th and then the impact of the Iraq intervention and then because of the secular trends in shift in power that are not as significant as the declinists say, but are still significant. What we now know is that we were looking at a fairly narrow window of of really unbridled U.S. unipolarity. And so we had, in part facilitated, ironically, by September 11th. So we had, if you want to talk, this is a critical juncture. And the critical juncture is probably decided, you're right, in December 2000.
Right.
But nobody knows that ahead of time, because nobody knows that September 11th is going to happen, and it's going to create opportunities for major executive action vis-a-vis going to war with places in the United States, and for changes in the U.S. state-society relations, primarily around counterterrorism, civil liberties. And nobody knows that it's going to create a window of opportunity to re-bargain certain things about international politics.
But is this
a window that
I guess.
I'm sorry.
Well, okay. Part of my question in this, and what I'm thinking about here, is this is this new this developing structure that we have, this notional developing structure, is it a structure that is sufficiently robust to survive something like the victory, the presidential victory of just to toss out a name, John McCain in 2004, who is conceivably backed by neoconservative elements, and perhaps even runs on something like we need to invade Iraq, right? And perhaps that's even made explicit within this argument. And so, is the structure of this alternative international order that we're talking about? I mean, is there any robustness to this structure that can survive changes in American politics? Right. I mean, even fairly short-term changes in American politics. Because if there isn't, then it's not much of a juncture, right? I mean, if the only change here is that American policy changes, and American policy operates in a much more institutionalist direction between 2001 and 2004, and then in 2004, sort of the more interventionist wing comes in, and I mean, can they just break all of that happens and sort of take the global struggle against violent extremism in the same way that we in fact saw it going under the Bush administration?
Well, I'm not. I mean, my answer is yes, because I need to be clear. I'm not talking about, Gore War on Terror does not produce kumbaya liberal utopia government, right, which could be a dystopia. It just means that we get thicker regulative institutions with respect to things that are relevant to terrorism and counterterrorism. Right. We probably get better arms inspection. We get better interdiction of we get sort of new rules, regulations, and arms trafficking. We get more cooperation on interdicting terrorist finances. Right. So and we get probably more buy-in. Now this is going to get, if this had happened and it played out the way I'm suggesting, the U.S. is doing some ugly stuff. It's helping the Russians the way they want to in Chechnya, right? In Dagestan. It's helping the Chinese probably a bit more in, instead of turning a blind eye to the Uyghurs, it's probably more complicit in some of the stuff that's going on. So this is not happy, shiny land, right? It's just a different, but I think those institutions would be more robust. And the reason I'd say this is that the Bush administration did build a lot of institutional capacity, particularly around, say, monitoring of financial flows, right? States were willing to do that even after they got really angry at the Bush administration, right? So I don't think that McCain comes in and he rips that stuff up, and I don't think other states withhold it. If he wins magically in 2004 and then invades Iraq. So then there are, so there is this moment to create sort of, as you say, thicker elements of the international order that will endure even as U.S. policy changes. And the reason we know this is because the Bush administration created, thin elements of this that endured despite the anger of the Bush administration. This stuff is, I don't want to undersell some of the Bush administration's accomplishments.
No, and neither am I. That wasn't my intention either, right? It was just sort of to say what survives, right? Because I guess one way that I'm thinking about this is that, it reaffirms how central even relatively short-term decisions are of the hegemon and the liberal internationalist order, right? I mean, if you can sort of step back and make the argument that there are going to be consequential differences in the liberal internationalist order based on who happens to be president at the time, who happens to be, which I think we all accept, right? I mean, you'd be foolish to deny that, but and on the constitution of the foreign policy elite that happens to be in power at the time, then it just sort of makes me wonder, well, what happens when those key elements within the hegemon change? Right, and how does that then change? To what extent? And again, we get back to this. One of the reasons that the international order is attractive is because it binds the sovereign, right? It binds the hegemon, right? So, to what extent can hegemon create for itself boundaries which it will be forced to to abide by in the future, especially when there are elements who just sort of don't care for those boundaries. Does any of that make sense? What I just said?
No, it makes sense, and it gets it's a core problem, right? And it's the heart of the debate between realists and liberal internationalists in academia, right? I mean, it's not the heart of the debate. The heart of the debate is, can you tame power, and and our institutions, But the heart of the debate about American foreign policy really does come down to, is the sort of Eikenberry story a nice story that we can tell our children when we put them to sleep, our allies when we tuck them in at night, or what have you, or is it in fact really true that there are institutional constraints created by the order on the hegemon, right, as opposed to on other people or other states. I don't think we have great answers to that question because of the nature of international political inquiry, right? The nature of the kinds of scholarship we do, and the nature of the end or what have you. But I would say that I think that the liberal internationalists overestimate the degree to which, or these things are actually binding, right? Which is to say that no UN resolution is going to keep the United States from intervening in Iraq, right? The U.S. at the end of the day can choose to ignore a large swath of these institutions. It might have harder problems ignoring the WTO in certain circumstances, given certain actors who have the capacity to inflict harm on it, but certainly in the military security arena, I don't think that these things are, they're not iron chains. But they really do structure practice and diplomatic practice in ways that we often forget. There is even if at the sort of margin, even at the sort of extremes, we can talk about the U.S. sort of deciding to ignore the Geneva Conventions by creating a new category of illegal combatants or what have you. And the fact is, it didn't really entirely do that at the end of the day. I mean, for all the abuses, right? The fact of the matter is that our bureaucracy is set up. The things have to be vetted through lawyers, through international law. We are engaged in these institutions. We're forced to justify ourselves beside them. They have really consequential effects that I think they don't prevent you from waking up tomorrow and exerting all your might to break them, but they do channel your activities in important ways, and they do circumscribe some of the possibilities. I mean, you have to make one way of putting this is that if you want to rip all this stuff up, really rip it up, you have to make an active decision to do that, and that active decision is a huge signal. Right, much more than the Bush administration really ripped anything up. Right, if you really talk about the maximum of this, you really have to do things that send very clear, unequivocal signals to the rest of the international community what it can expect from the United States or from any great power. And so, in that sense, yeah, they don't bind, but they do condition. Right. If that makes any sense.
And some people think about these kinds of things as sort of the invisible diplomacy or what's going on below, but really in some sense, these kinds of agreements, norms, practices, whatnot, constitute 95% of what we think of as international relations on a daily basis, or at least that's how I understand it, or how I think about it, which is in terms of diplomatic practice, in terms of basic compliance with with the various rules that nations make with one another, in terms of those things as basic commercial agreements and maritime agreements and so forth, and that those become increasingly robust, and as you suggest, either they become internalized, right? They are internalized in the daily practice of executive organizations, of executive agencies, even in the United States.
Another way to think about this question, and I'm not going to give a long answer, but it's just to say, imagine if the Bush administration had succeeded in getting UN approval for the intervention in Iraq. Mm-hmm. Not the legalistic argument that it already had it, but it had gotten an active resolution saying, after 4 months, you can invade. I think that would have made a lot of, I don't know, I think it would have certainly had consequential effects on what happened in the aftermath of the invasion. It would have had consequential effects for the way that it would have affected the impact of the Iraq invasion on our relations, etc. So the flip side of that is that, it creates opportunities that ignoring them are as if you've been bound in some ways. But yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, 98% of, we focus, this is the whole heart of the practice turn in international relations theory is, to say we focus on the 1 or 2% of big ticket items, as it were, but most of what happens in international politics really is pretty habitual, pretty bureaucratized, pretty institutionalized, whether it's at the foreign policy level or at the transnational level, and that in fact, that is does operate by standing operating. That is, basically SOP land. It's standard operating procedure land.
So, to then, I mean, we've been talking for a long time, but to make a leap to this other thing, we were talking about this myth of liberal international order, this piece that came out in the national interest. I mean, I guess one of the reasons I found it a little bit unsatisfying was that it didn't seem to capture exactly what you just mentioned, right? It seemed to, when I think of liberal international order, that's sort of what I think of is these modes of habits and so forth that have formed. Yeah, and just to digress for a second, these modes or these habits are really obvious when they're absent, right? I mean, it really sort of stands out when they're absent, and that was sort of, if anything, the thing about the Taliban, the Afghanistan under the Taliban, that sort of most stood out was this is a state that does not act in a habitual fashion, and it doesn't act like other states. And it acts weirdly, right? And it sort of brought into stark relief, at least for me at the time. Wow, this is a state that's not acclimated. This is a state that's not socialized to the norms of sort of basic international behavior, and thus, consequentially, these are sort of what these norms are.
That's an awesome point. We talk about Iran. Let's set North Korea aside. We talk about Iran as a rogue state, and of course, it's out of compliance with the IAEA, et cetera, et cetera. You want to talk about a state, but that's exactly right. If you want to talk about a state that is not, is not conforming to expectations, norms, and routines, it's Afghanistan under the Taliban, and somebody ought to write a paper about it.
Right. Somebody should. But I've even heard some arguments that the destruction of the Buddhas was, like a key explicit part of Al-Qaeda's strategy of making certain that that the Taliban were not going to acquire those habits of rational behavior. But anyway, I can't remember where I read that argument. But anyway, so then fast forward into this myth of liberal international order. Which was this national interest piece, and the names of the authors sort of fall outside of my head, have fallen outside of my head, but we'll link.
It's Barma, Ratner, Weber,
right?
Those people. Sorry, I talked over.
I mean, I guess, do you share my skepticism about their argument on this basis, right? That they're just kind of missing out on this 98% of international relations that has become so SOP habitual within a liberal internationalist context, that they're just not seeing most of the impact of the liberal international order when they're talking about this very high politics stuff that, the BRICS are establishing banks and so forth.
So, I love the world without the West argument. In fact, it's very similar to and has informed a bunch of the academic work I'm doing now. I don't like that piece, and I don't like that piece for the same reason I think that you don't like that piece. Well, and Josh Busby at the Duck of Minerva did a great response to this, where he basically said, that on the one hand they set up this straw man of liberal order, right, as if the ideas in FDR's head when the UN was founded were plucked out and made real, right?
Right.
And so they posit a liberal order. They say, what liberal order? And then the standard they have of liberal order is, that we're all, as I said earlier, singing Kumbaya and resolving our problems multilaterally and not resorting to war ever, and so on, right? And so that part of the argument, right? Yeah, I mean, it's just, that the liberal order doesn't exist, and that the liberal order isn't conditioning, and that it's really weak, and it never really existed. That's just, it's wrong on so many levels.
Right.
The flip side of that is their argument about alternative order building is, I think, pretty important. And it's cutesy. I mean, they have this, apps and, rooting around, and they're describing a lot of different kinds of activity that way. But I think that they're right, and they've been right, that one of the untold stories, or the inadequately told stories, is that the way that U.S. hegemony, so we're all obsessed with the rise of China, the decline of the United States, and we're in this hegemonic war, we're in this power transition mode, and they're very good at this in their academic writings, where we sort of say, we think, okay, it's the rise of China, decline of the United States, and there'll be some big struggle, and then somebody will emerge victorious, or maybe there'll be a simulation, everybody will get along, and those are the outcomes. But really what's the real risk for the international order and the hegemonic order is that it's being hollowed out by these alternative order building attempts. And you're right that these aren't fundamentally challenging basic precepts about the way that diplomacy works, or the very fact that we use institutions to do all these things, right, which is a relatively new development, because what a lot of this alternative order building is doing, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or various other institutions, regional organizations, banks, whatever, is they're aping, right, the fundamental commitment of liberal internationalism, which is that you build institutions, you build regional fora, you multilateralize
things.
So
they're creating explicit structures sort of along the lines of liberal international, but apart from the sort of broader thrust of liberal internationalism.
Right. So the practices at that level are liberal intergovernmental. Why they matter is that they are essentially they essentially also provide a mechanism for often authoritarian states, or states that are bought into elements of liberalism but not other elements, to do the kinds of things that they would normally go to the liberal order, quote unquote, to do, without the conditions that they don't want or the externalities that they see as negative, right? So if you do a big partnership with the United States on counterterrorism, you're likely to have various kinds of U.S. legal conditions put down on what you aren't supposed to be doing. You're likely to get certain restrictions on what the aid can be used for. And you're going to have U.S. officials running around, and those U.S. officials are going to be interfacing with your officials. And, if you're a closed authoritarian system, that's not necessarily something you want to happen.
Right.
Even worse, you're going to wind up with Western NGOs hanging out, right? And they might publicize massacres or put pressure on you or build civil society capacity and all that sort of stuff. So, instead of, so if your only option is it's that U.S.-led Western international order or nothing, you're pretty much stuck, right? You either have to opt out and not get any of the goodies, or you got to put up with it.
Sort of the Uzbekistan dilemma in a sense, right? I mean, when you talk about this, I just think about Central Asian regimes. They just sort of leap out the quandaries that they're in, which is probably why so many of them are part of the SCO.
Right. I mean, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a good example of an attempt to do this, because what do? They do counterterrorism, counter-narcotics.
Mm-hmm.
When they were first formed, there was all this, it's going to be this upgraded, it's going to be this challenge to NATO, but it's not engaged in military balancing.
Mm-hmm.
It's engaged in public goods substitution or club goods substitution. It's trying to substitute for the goodies you get from the order. Alex Cooley's book on Central Asia really does a nice job of talking about some of this. I mean, this Central Asia is where this stuff started playing out much earlier, primarily because the U.S. went in after September 11th, right? In that sense, there's a kind of hollowing out effect, because now you can either look to other patrons or band together to provide the goods yourself. I mean, one of the things that the SCO does is it sends election observers, right? So you got the spectacle of Chinese election observers saying, oh yes, the Kazakh election was totally free and fair. Oh yes, the Russian election was totally free and fair, right? And to us this may seem incredibly stupid because who would ever believe that? But at the very least it sends muddy signals. One of the things we know is that if you have clear unequivocal signals from the international community that your election was fraudulent, that provides a lot of boost to the opposition.
Right. And so this provides a necessary service to the regime that basically wants to fix elections. Right.
So on the one hand, it provides in one scenario you opt out, you exit, but you can still get this stuff. More commonly, what it means is you have leverage. You have an exit option, and you can use that to come back and say, we'll accept this, but we'll only go so far. Or if you really want, if you're the U.S. and you really want to be involved in Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan kicks the U.S. out after the U.S. starts ratcheting up pressure after the Anjan massacre, Adajan massacre. I never say it correctly. But the U.S. is back in Uzbekistan, more or less, and not at the same level, but again, without all these externalities, because the Uzbeks were able to basically say, if you want to be here, you got to play by our rules. And you've got this in less sort of security area, arenas. You've got this kind of stuff going on. This was the significance. You mentioned Latin America. This is what the Chavez movement was up to, right? And this is what the Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela. It wasn't, it was largely through petrodollars from Venezuela.
Right.
Was enabled to sort of say, we will provide an alternative source for this stuff. And so what happens, the U.S. loses its counter-narcotics bases because you no longer need the U.S. around.
Right.
You don't need to get it from the Americans. And so you don't have to put up with what the U.S. expects in return for that. So on the one hand, the extreme version of this is where we'll have the West do hollow out the Western order. The liberal order, in their view, is gone. And I don't think it's that the liberal order is gone. It's just that some aspects of the liberal order that regimes don't like no longer carry with it. But you still have a kind of small L thin liberalism, because these various activities are the kinds of things we're doing are compatible with small L liberalism.
Right. Well, as you suggested, it works in two ways, because you do have this small L liberalism, and at the same time, you have sort of a fundamental granting of bargaining power within sort of a large L international order, right? That states don't just have to take or leave the large L international order because it gives them opportunity to opt out of aspects of it.
But we should say that this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, there's increasing evidence so we all talk about Chinese currency manipulation, Japanese currency manipulation, like that. But if you actually look at the timing of the big acquisitions of U.S. debt reserves, and even at that point, starting to buy the euro, right? In East Asia, it's actually correlated with the aftermath of the 1998 East Asian financial crisis, and so there is increasing evidence. And even if this doesn't turn out to be the intent, this is the effect, that one reason why these countries are acquiring all of these reserves is because they don't want to have to go to the IMF the next time. Right. And so this is an old phenomenon. I mean, this is in part the story of why conditional aid never worked during the Cold War, because you could always go to the Soviets, or you could always threaten to exit, right? But it's happening again. I know we like to bash him, and there are lots of reasons to bash him, but one of the good things about Parag Khanna's early work was he did identify this dynamic and popularize it, even though it was in all this other kind of stuff.
It was with a lot of dread, but no, I think there's definitely that theme, right? Sort of this. That's one of the major themes of Second World. However much I may have hated that book, I mean this notion that there are alternative systems developing.
And one last point about this, everybody's doing it. I mean, the international political economy literature has become very interested in forum shopping, right? Which is that you don't get what you want from one multilateral organization, one development bank, you go to a different one, right? Well, one of the textbook examples of this is the U.S. intervention in Kosovo, right? The U.S. doesn't get what it wants in the UN, so it goes to NATO, right? Which is why it's always going to be a more complicated story than liberal order, no liberal order, right? It's really a story about the attenuation of order and the creation of alternative forms of liberalism that maybe capture some of the liberal economics that some states want without the political civil society stuff that they don't want, or which is more accommodating of certain kinds of deviant practices or what have you. And that is a story about the hollowing out of hegemony if it goes a certain way. If these are used to exit from, or these are used primarily to exit or lever when the U.S. is trying to use these institutions and use this order to get what it wants.
See, the next thing I would ask is a sort of a big question about how we would go about interpreting everything that we've just talked about, sort of from the context of sort of end the 70s era, end of hegemony theory in international relations, right? And so, how I guess Robert Cohen's still around, so you can ask him. But so how we fit this in, or how we not fit this into, but how we fit it with sort of the broad arguments that were being made in the 70s and 80s, the after hegemony style argument about whether institutions like this would persist. Because if we take this argument seriously, and I think there's every reason to take it seriously, right? I mean, I think there's a good, making a good case here. It's a world that looks different than sort of the world that the first neoliberal theorists really talked about, sort of in which you had this dichotomy between, the end of hegemony, you retreat to a neo-realist world, and sort of their understanding of the end of hegemony was the end of the dominance of the United States within the Western sphere, and this world in which the basic fundamental institutions persist and keep everybody more or less behaving. Sort of in what you're talking about now and what we're talking about today, we kind of have neither of those going on, right? That in some ways, people continue to behave in a fashion, by pursuing all of these neoliberal style arrangements, but they're behaving in this fashion because they see sort of genuine benefits, not because they're constrained by the legacy orders of American hegemony, right? I mean, they're sort of constrained by the goods because they have fed upon the goods that have been provided by this order, but they're figuring out new ways to provide the order. And I don't think we actually have time to delve completely into that.
But this is the key point, right? And this is where a lot of the debate is, right? This is, is liberalism so powerful? Is it so successful as liberal intergovernmentalism and some basic elements of liberalism, open economies, that it persists? This gets into questions like, is major war obsolete, right? Because obviously, if there's another great power war, all bets are off. So yeah, you're right. There's I hadn't thought about that. There's a real Back to the Future aspect to this, which isn't surprising, fears of U.S. relative decline, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at it in a kind of broader sense, and, I don't know whether, we actually mentioned this earlier, and I don't know whether we had some technical issues, I don't know whether it'll be in the final version, but what we're talking about is the workings out of the reversal of the great divergence of the 19th century, right? So, fundamentally, this goes back to Europe industrializes, and so suddenly Europe was doing pretty well in some respects prior to industrialization. There's a whole huge debate about, how, whether the divergence happened earlier and had to do with commercial vitality and North Atlantic seaports or what have you. But, putting that aside, it's very clear that, British Industrial Revolution, its diffusion to Europe, upended the global balance of power. It made Europe it made these sort of barbarians the most powerful people on the planet. Right. And they, through colonialism and through the two great wars in 1945 and U.S. having 50% of GDP, world GDP at the end of 45 and what that enabled it to do, the U.S., the broader European world reconstructed the globe, while the former power centers of Asia were, basically behind or playing catch-up. And then we've seen in fits and starts and reversals over the last 60, 70 years, maybe, the narrowing of that gap.
Right.
We've seen more and more global convergence. And it could be reversed, it could be fragile, but it just seems that the trend is that way. Technology diffuses, people catch up, Asia is rising no matter how you think that plays out versus U.S. power. And that means that you have all sorts of players who were not really key players. I mean, China was one of the big five, but not, but really, the nationalists, whatever. You have all these new players who are now interfacing with institutions that were designed without them, right? Or at least were designed when they weren't the key players. Right. And that's going to have big implications, and it's going to mean there's a lot of stuff is going to get renegotiated. But whether it means the end of liberalism in the broad sense of the word, I'm not so sure. And whether it really means, a reversion to old-style power politics, I don't even know what the era of old-style power politics was. 40 years of Europe, right? Yeah, things are. We're seeing tectonic shifts that are happening faster than tectonic shifts happened in the last millennia of human history, all because of industrial revolution and et cetera, et cetera. And it's exciting and interesting and dangerous, and I think that's the best we can say about it.
Well, and in this broad scope of questions about how relevant is the Iraq War for the future of the liberal international order, the answer to that, it's hard to say how the answer to that can ever be very large, right? The coefficient on that question can never be very large, even if there's a p below 0.05, right?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. That's kind of flip, but
no, the liberal, or if there is a liberal order in 50 years, it won't look like the liberal order of the 90s, right, which didn't look like the liberal order of the 60s, right? If you wanted, there's this tinge of realism to what you said, and this is, academic inside baseball. But look, the book that the book that sort of that we now look back as a globalization book, but the term didn't exist, was Cohen and Nye's Power and Independence, right? And that was a book that said the nature of power is shifting, and and they constructed two ideal types, the realist one where it's all military force, and then the sort of liberal interdependence one where it's all multi-vectored and confusing and screwy, and you can use oil to leverage things and stuff like that. And my gut is that Cohen and Nye were more right, but that they weren't realist enough about the implications, if that makes any sense. Which is to say that power politics never looked exactly the way that realists thought it did, and particularly the way that realism evolved in the 80s and 90s, the type that we see debated on blogs and popular things, is really a very jaundiced realism. It's a realism that says, military power, deterrence, and then the debate about how aggressive states are, okay? Or, the determinants of alliance formation. Realism in its more traditional form is an understanding that power politics is there, even if not deliberately, in all politics, that all politics is power politics. And so even in a world in which, yes, right now we need to, one of the implications of this is that one of the implications of what we've seen is that there are more and different ways of exercising power, and we shouldn't ignore alternative order building. It's a form of, it has huge power political implications for influence and leverage. Another implication is that, Asia is going through its proto-balancing pangs, what you talked about earlier, states looking to the U.S. as an offshore balance, or China having played its hand too early and freaked out a bunch of its neighbors when it really should have, really should have waited about 20 years until the power window had shifted more in its favor, right? That looks pretty realist, but it's in this environment with all these other forms of power and influence, and where the game is
so part of the problem with sort of how, and again, this going to be painful to people who are familiar with the academic study of international relations. But part of the problem comes, and this, I think a lot of people identified this during the 1990s, that you were having the formation of two armed camps within sort of within the discipline who wanted to treat power much differently in ways that were sort of did quite a bit of violence to how we traditionally understood realism, right? Where it shouldn't be that hard to conceive of power in the context of even power being used in an institutional order. But sort of a lot of the literature was not particularly well served by this insight. It seems to be during the 1990s.
If you want the tag phrase, right? If you want the catchphrase, it might be what we're looking at now, and what we really care about in these kinds of discussions is the power politics of and in the liberal order.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And, well, no, I don't want to drag this back to the Iraq question. I actually have to go. We have to go. Foreign Entanglements viewers, I'm sure you have to go too. So, Dan, thanks very much for being on, and we will do this again soon.
Thanks for having me. I hope that not everybody was put to sleep by our exchange.
Oh, don't worry. They're not going to go to sleep. They're just going to turn off their computers. So it's fine.
Exactly.